In 1924, in a lecture hall that smelled of coal smoke and ink, a man rose to speak and said a word that would change how some of his listeners looked at the world forever. Accounts from the time tell us that his lecture was broken up, that papers were taken from his hands, that officials moved through the audience as if to interrupt a pattern that had begun to show itself. The details are reported, sometimes disputed, and often colored by the passions of those who loved or hated him. But the story that survived, no matter how it was told, was not only about censorship. It was about naming, about the moment when someone pointed at an invisible architecture and gave it a name. That name, spoken into the air, made a pattern visible in a way that people who had lived inside it for years suddenly recognized. What happens when a culture discovers the true name of a force that shapes its thinking and behavior? Across many traditions, from secret names in ancient ritual to the whispered syllables of mystical paths, there is a belief that naming is not merely descriptive. To know the name of something is to take away part of its power to act in the dark. It is to turn a ghost into a shape you can point to and study. Steiner, the thinker at the center of this story, insisted on exactly this kind of operation. Call the force by its name, and you alter the relationship between mind and world. He called that particular force Ahriman. You may see his term spelled in different ways in older sources: Ahriman, Ahriman, Amon. So for clarity, we will use the common form, Ahriman. Listen closely to that first fact: a single act of naming. Not an invocation of power, but an invitation to observe. There is a legal and philosophical lineage to the idea that a name changes things. In some mythic systems, to know a name is to hold a gate. In languages of secrecy, names are kept because they make the unknown breachable. Steiner was pointing to something different and more modern, a socio-cultural mechanism that once named becomes legible, a set of tendencies in Western thought and technology that push consciousness into particular shapes. If this kind of excavation, the history of ideas and the hidden habits of attention, interests you, stay with this exploration and consider subscribing or turning on notifications to follow the investigations that unfold from it. What follows will not be a conspiracy expose offered as proof, nor a panegyric to paranoia. It is an interpretive, philosophical reading, a set of observations and arguments that invite verification not by faith, but by attention and experiment. Rudolf Steiner was a peculiar figure to play this role. Trained originally in natural science and steeped in the cultural ferment of fin de siècle Europe, he built a career as a thinker who moved freely between lectures on Goethe, educational experiments, and sweeping statements about the spiritual currents of modernity.
He called his work anthroposophy, a path of human knowing that aimed to bring the spiritual and the practical into living conversation. To his listeners, he was at once a scholar, a poet, and to some, an unsettling prophet. His critics labeled him mystical. His followers took his warnings as roadmaps. When Steiner spoke about Ahriman, he was not naming a person or charging an identifiable cabal with conspiracy. He was, in his own frame, pointing to an archetypal tendency, that which seeks to solidify and materialize consciousness, to press the living into dead systems of measurement. The image he offered was not of a devil in the streets, but of a principle that, if left unchecked, would shape institutions, technologies, and minds until everything seemed to move as if beneath a clockwork lid. The allegedly suppressed papers and interrupted lectures are, in this context, symbolic as much as historical. The moment when a thinker declared that the civilizational machinery had a pattern and therefore could be named. Why does this matter now? Because naming is the first step towards resistance. It is the liminal act that takes an experience from the realm of vague unease and brings it into the space of analysis. People who live inside a system that colonizes attention often don't know they are inside it. They feel those effects, anxiety, the shrinking of inner life, a sense that time slips through their fingers, but lack the map to trace the cause. A name is a map's first legend. To understand Steiner's diagnosis, we need to trace an intellectual lineage, the ideas, technologies, and metaphors that conspired, over centuries, not overnight, to make a world amenable to measurement. Think of Newton's physics, the universe as a predictable machine. Think of Darwin's theory, entropic narrative and selection without teleology. When a society comes to trust measurement and statistical explanation as the highest forms of knowledge, certain kinds of visibility become privileged. What can be counted is real, what cannot be quantified is suspect, mysterious, or irrelevant. That inventory, this worship of metrics, was not born in a moment, but it became an axis of modernity. From that axis grew institutions and instruments, factories that optimized labor by the second, schools that standardized curriculum by tests, economies that valued measurable productivity above depth. Each innovation solved problems, efficiency, disease, hunger, but it also trained attention to be responsive to signals that could be amplified and monetized. The human propensity to look where light falls was, in modern times, turned into an economic opportunity. Attention itself became currency. Technology took what those intellectual currents started and accelerated them. Where once a watch could regulate a worker's day, algorithms now calculate the contours of a person's desires.
Engineers and behavioral scientists design engagement loops that keep eyes and minds returning, feeds that predict which content will provoke a click, a scroll, or a purchase. These are not conspiratorial claims. They are documented features of a digital attention economy that monetizes human response. But seen through Steiner's lens, these technical mechanisms are not neutral. They are the contemporary instruments of a tendency that prefers predictability over mystery, measurement over meaning. Imagine this as a stage play. The scenery is immaculate. The lighting cues are scientific. You move through your days as an actor who believes the set is the whole world. You check your prop devices, phones, screens, dashboards, and you respond to their prompts. The performance feels real because it is precise. And yet, what seems most lifelike is also most staged. The Ahrimanic tendency, as Steiner described it, is the drive to build that stage out of reality itself, to transform living processes into engineered interactions. It is here that film metaphors help translate the abstraction into felt experience. In The Matrix, the protagonist glimpses the code behind everyday appearances and must decide whether to accept the comfortable illusion or endure the messier truth. In The Truman Show, life is literally staged to manufacture predictable emotions and behaviors for an audience. In 1984, surveillance and language itself are bent to make a particular political grammar feel inevitable. These are not precise philosophical analogues to Steiner's imagery, but they are instructive. Each film dramatizes how systems can create realities that manage attention, narrow possibility, and produce obedient behavior. Ask yourself, when a feed knows predictably what you will like, does your preference remain free? When notifications arrive with the authority of urgency, who is directing your heart rate? When institutions rely on dashboards and key performance indicators to evaluate meaning, what parts of human experience quietly disappear from that ledger? These questions do not presume malevolent intent in every application of technology. They ask us to see the pattern by which technologies that optimize engagement can also erode interior life. Steiner's Ahriman is not solely about devices. He located the same tendency inside ideas and institutions. Mathematics, when used as a kind of metaphysical anchor, risks turning life into an equation. Bureaucracy, when it values measurable compliance above creative judgment, turns living agency into a function. Materialism, as an interpretive stance that denies anything beyond the measurable, flattens nuance into data points. Ahriman, then, is the anthropological drift, the cultural pressure towards externalization, objectification, and mechanization. This drift has consequences for how people experience themselves. Perception becomes an architecture of control.
Not because someone designed it from the top down as an occult plan, but because technologies and institutions created to be efficient end up training the senses to respond in predictable patterns. Attention narrows, depth erodes. The inner witness, the capacity to hold a present moment without collapsing it into reaction, grows faint. There is a particular kind of diminishment that follows, the micro-death of attention. It's not sudden, not cinematic. It is granular. 1,000 tiny interruptions over months and years grade down our capacity for sustained focus, for contemplative solitude, for listening to the barely audible voice inside. When those capacities fade, we become easier to predict and to channel. Our joys become commodities. Our fears become triggers sold to advertisers. The architecture is not only external. It fashions a new interior economy where every feeling is a data point awaiting monetization. To say all this is not to condemn technology wholesale. Instruments are what we make of them. The difference is that technologies designed within an harmonic frame, whose primary metrics are engagement and predictability, tend to valorize measurable outcomes at the cost of qualitative richness. The result is a civilization that prizes calculation over wonder, efficiency over ritual, and speed over depth. Steiner offered a diagnosis, but he also insisted on a method of verification. Do not take my word for it. Test it. He urged people to look inward and see whether these patterns matched their lived experience. That epistemic humility is crucial. The claim is philosophical and phenomenological, not an empirical indictment of named conspirators. It calls for personal investigation. Notice what distracts you. Track how thought patterns shift in the presence of screens. Attend to the texture of your feelings when engaged by different media. The point is to move from accusation to inquiry, from naming to testing. Yet naming alone is not neutral either. Naming makes visible, but it can also attract resistance. If a culture benefits from harmonic structures because they produce order, stability, and material comfort, then speaking that name can be uncomfortable for those invested in that order. That discomfort explains much of the friction Steiner encountered. It also explains why the idea continues to resonate. It puts into words a disquiet many people feel but cannot locate. The modern incarnation of the controlling principle takes advantage of one more modern development, the compression of social life into platforms that mediate not only information but attention and relationship. Platforms are designed to capture engagement. Their business models reward sustained interaction. Algorithms that learn to predict behavior become feedback loops that encourage conformity. Behavioral design borrows from psychology, intermittent rewards, variable reinforcement, and social validation mechanisms.
All of this concatenates into a system where the environment continually nudges you toward predictable states. Consider a simple loop. You wake up and reach for your phone. The first notification is not a neutral fact, it is a constructed invitation. Click here, reply now, consume this. Your dopamine system responds, a micro-reward. The algorithm records which content elicits that reward. It adjusts. The next feed is slightly more tailored. Over time, your pattern becomes legible to the machine. The machine can then amplify what it predicts you'll prefer. The human in this scenario becomes a node in a predictive mesh. This predictive mesh is not only economic, it is epistemic. When your attention is guided by what maximizes engagement, your window onto reality narrows to what performs. Controversy, outrage, and immediacy often perform better than deep thought. That is not simply a flaw in design, it is the structural logic of systems optimized for measurable interaction. The consequences are cultural. Attention gravitates to spectacle, nuance is starved. There is another, subtler effect. Predictive systems encourage a kind of mimicry, an internalization of external expectations. You begin to think in the categories presented to you. You reply the way you have seen others reply. You model your interior life on curated exemplars. The stage is no longer just external, it becomes intrapsychic. The ahrimanic tendency to objectify and predict penetrates subjectivity itself. These descriptions can read as dystopian theater. They are the language of warning, yes, but also of practical diagnosis. If we can identify patterns, we can begin to create interventions. Before we get to those interventions, however, we must understand the complementary side of Steiner's dialectic, the force he called Lucifer. If Ahriman is the principle of materialization and calculation, Lucifer, in Steiner's vocabulary, names a different distortion, the principle of ungrounded spiritualizing, a seductive ascent into realms of imagination and dissociation without grounding in embodied reality. Where Ahriman draws life into the ledger, Lucifer lifts consciousness out of the body into airy visions that may sound liberating but can end in detachment. Both extremes are traps. One flattens life into data, the other offers flight without anchor. Think of how many modern temptations take Luciferic forms, the promise of effortless transcendence, the seductive charisma of ideas that promise liberation without responsibility, the spiritual movements that emphasize ecstatic escape over moral action. Coupled with Ahriman's draw toward measurable outcomes, these two tendencies create a dialectic in which modern people are pulled either into numb compliance or into unmoored dreaming. The middle path Steiner equated with what he sometimes called the Christ impulse, an awkward phrase for some listeners because it borrows a term from religious language, meant something specific in his work, the capacity to bring together embodiment and insight, to be present in the world while also holding an inner horizon of meaning. In our terms, it is the practice of being fully alive and awake, anchored in the body, yet open to depth. The danger of extremes is visible in 1,000 contemporary vignettes. Consider the engineer who believes every human problem can be solved by better prediction algorithms and becomes indifferent to ethical questions about inner life. Consider the spiritual influencer who promises quick transcendence through curated practices, leaving followers with a fragile sense of identity and no real resilience. One extreme manufactures conformity, the other manufactures fragile dissociation. The remedy, Steiner suggested, lies in practices that cultivate presence, judgment, and the capacity to perceive without being captured. But what does presence mean in a world designed to fragment attention? Presence in this register is less a mystical state and more a skill. It is the muscle of sustained attending, the ability to notice without immediately regurgitating the notice into a social media update, the patience to hold a thought or pain or wonder without seeking instant external validation. Presence is the opposite of the micro-death of attention. It is the interior environment Ahriman cannot easily quantify. To make this concrete, consider the contrast between 2 afternoons. In the first, a person spends hours under the pull of feeds, short bursts of outrage, celebratory scrolls, constant red badges demanding a glance. Time passes, yet little of meaning is created. In the second, the same person closes the feed, sits in quiet, listens to a recorded piece of music slowly, and traces its textures. The latter is not necessarily mystical. It is an exercise in attention, in reclaiming time from a system that would monetize each micro-moment. It is a small, practical resistance. Steiner's epistemic insistence, test it yourself, is a radical decentralizing instruction. It takes power away from doctrinal authorities and hands it to experience. If naming Ahriman is the first act of diagnosis, then the second act is disciplined practice. That practice is not guaranteed to produce salvation narratives. It offers instead a method for recalibrating the senses. In a culture that has been trained to prize measurement, revalorizing interior measure is revolutionary precisely because it is quietly unprofitable. Guards at the gate of monetized attention seldom notice the person who sits in a room reading a book with no intention of posting about it. Before we move from diagnosis to the practical program Steiner outlines, what the DNA calls weapons that resist the trap, consider a single everyday telling story.
A young woman, call her Mara, wakes to find her life rearranged by a dozen small nudges. An app nudges her to check a gift card. A network suggests a trending article she must read to stay informed. A friend's post invites her to react immediately. Over weeks, the pattern of rapid responses becomes her default. She notices that a sense of inner silence, those moments that used to be fertile, has receded. When she tries to sit with a thought for an hour, anxiety rises. The pattern feels almost mechanical, a responsive organism shaped by external promptings. This is not a tale of malevolence directed at Mara by shadowy figures. It is, instead, an account of how systems evolve that reward certain patterns and thereby produce their replication in human minds. The machine does not need to command, it merely coaxes and accumulates. The result is a subtle realignment of desire and habit. Now imagine Mara learning the name of the pattern affecting her life. She hears the word Ahriman, and for reasons she cannot wholly articulate, begins to see the threats. She notices the ways measurement, prediction, and commodified attention shaped her rhythms. Naming makes the architecture legible. Naming begins the work of undoing the automatism. There is danger here too, because naming can be misused. When people grab a term like Ahriman and use it as a blanket explanation for every personal struggle, they risk turning a diagnostic tool into an excuse. Responsibility remains. Steiner's method was never meant to absolve the individual of action. It was meant to reorient the person toward practices that strengthen discernment. At the edge of this narrative, we reach a pivotal question. What are the concrete ways someone like Mara can begin to reclaim attention and resist the objectifying tendencies of our age? How do you practice presence in a society that profits on your distraction? How do you ground imagination so that it serves life instead of dissolving it? These are practical questions with experiential answers. Steiner would have insisted, and for good reason, that the proof is in doing.
Naming clarifies the problem, practice tests the claim. The next step is to lay out the practices that act as modest, testable interventions, ways of reclaiming attention, methods of cultivating free thinking, disciplines of emotional alchemy, approaches to recognizing destiny and meaning, and the reintroduction of art and solitude as non-commodified spaces of experience. Each of these is a tool in the tempering of a soul under pressure. Each invites verification. Try it for a week, notice changes, report back. That insistence on verification keeps the conversation away from dogma. But before we assemble that toolkit, before we script stepped exercises or list the 5 weapons, there is one more element to examine: the way modern knowledge systems legitimize the very patterns that Ahrimanic tendencies exploit.
The authority of metrics, the social trust in dashboards, the cultural prestige of prediction, these are not merely incidental. They function as cultural norms that reward compliance. When an entire epistemic environment places weight on measurement, the incentives change. People orient their thinking to metrics because life rewards metritized success. The question then becomes ethical as well as practical. How do we revalue capacities that resist quantification without romanticizing innocence? We will return to concrete practices. We will also return to the tension between the Luciferic and Ahrimanic extremes, and to Steiner's proposal for a centering impulse that can hold both embodiment and insight. For now, hold this: naming makes visible. Visibility invites responsibility. Responsibility requires practice. The world we inhabit is not a conspiracy to be slain, but a set of habits and technologies to be understood and, where necessary, transformed. Soon, we will examine a series of practical experiments you can run on yourself. Small, rigorous tests that ask nothing of you but attention. But as that practical work waits, consider one last scene. A man sits at a kitchen table at dusk. He turns off his phone screen, breathes, and places a small notebook before him. He writes a sentence. What did I notice today that felt true, not performative? The question seems absurd to the hurried mind. It seems too quiet for the day. But the act of writing that question is an act of naming in miniature. It calls a pattern into presence. Naming, it turns out, is not only for grand theoretical battles. It is the first movement of recovery in the simple economy of daily life. That man is not a hero. He is a tester. He is a person who has heard a name and decided to see whether it maps onto his life. His experiment will not overthrow any system overnight, but it may, in the small, begin to change the shape of his attention. And from such small changes, larger shifts grow. He writes the sentence and, for the first time in months, hears the question in the room rather than the appliance. What felt true, not performative? That small test is exactly the kind of experiment Steiner would applaud. It is humble. It is verifiable. It is, in its way, a naming. Not a grand cosmic appellation, but a domestic one. It is the act of turning interior fog into a single patient observation. From that evening at the kitchen table, our story widens again. Mara's choice to ask a simple question becomes the hinge that opens a series of modest experiments. The 5 practical weapons Steiner's diagnosis implies, translated for people who do not wear robes or preach from pulpits, but who live beneath the hum of routers and the blinking light of screens. These weapons are not miraculous talismans. They are disciplines, small, precise practices designed to strengthen capacities that technology and commodified attention quietly atrophy. Each can be tested. Each can be measured, not by external dashboards, but by the subtle metrics of what you can pay attention to, what you care about, and what you can hold without immediately performing it for an audience. The first weapon is attention reclamation, what many traditions call meditation, and what contemporary psychologists frame as sustained attention practice. The language matters less than the function, to train the mind to remain present, to notice without immediately reacting, to hold a moment as an object of observation rather than an itch for consumption. This is the practice that most directly challenges the micro-death of attention. An experiment you can run in a week. Commit to a daily 5-minute attention sit. Choose an anchor: breath, heartbeat, the feeling of the feet on the floor, the ring of a small bell. Sit in a chair, eyes open or closed, and simply notice the anchor. When thought wanders, note the fact of wandering and return the focus gently. No scoring, no guilt. Record in a small notebook after each sit what happened. How many times did you notice wandering? What was the quality of the returning? Did a particular emotion arise? After 7 days, examine the notes. You will not emerge illuminated in a single week, but you will begin to see patterns. Certain times of day are more fractious. Certain feeds are more seductive. Your capacity to hold a single thought may lengthen by seconds, that over months become minutes. For someone like Mara, the first week is astonishing in its ordinariness. She learns that 80% of her interruptions are habit-based, reaching for the phone without intention. She discovers that the mere act of recording the number of interruptions reduces them by half. This is not mystical. It is practical feedback. Attention reclamation is both practice and measurement. You train the muscle, and you track the increments of growth. The second weapon is free thinking, disciplined intellectual independence that resists homogenization. Free thinking does not mean endless contrarianism. It means cultivating the ability to examine one's inherited beliefs, to argue with one's comfortable assumptions, and to test the frameworks by which the world is interpreted. Under a harmonic pressure, beliefs are often internalized as metrics: how many shares a view gets, how socially legible it is, how neatly it fits an existing performance of identity. Free thinking asks you to treat ideas as experiments rather than badges. A practical protocol for free thinking is to run a contradiction week. Each day, pick a belief you hold, small or large, and write 3 reasons for it and 3 reasons against it. Push further. Write the best counter-argument you can imagine. Then write a short defense of your original position as if you were persuading someone who deeply disagrees. The exercise sharpens discernment. It reveals which beliefs are anchored by lived experience and which are shorelines painted by habit and echo chambers.
Consider Matteo, an engineer who had come to trust models and metrics as moral authorities. When he applied this exercise, he confronted the realization that his work's predictive models often simplified human values into loss functions. The contradiction weakness did not lead him to abandon modeling. It led him to redesign questions he had rarely asked. What values are being optimized, and who bears the cost? Free thinking, in practice, produces course corrections rather than revolutions. It reintroduces moral imagination into the calculus of design. The third weapon is emotional alchemy. Harmonic systems excel at harvesting and monetizing affect. They turn surprise, outrage, longing, and shame into data streams that can be amplified. Emotional alchemy is the art of discerning authentic feeling from engineered response, and then transforming raw feeling into constructive action. It is not therapy by ordinance, it is training in emotional literacy. Begin with a simple labeling practice. When a strong feeling arises, pause and name it. I notice irritation. I notice longing. I notice dread. Record the context. What prompted the emotion? What bodily sensations accompanied it? Was the trigger internal, a memory, an unmet need, or external, a notification, a headline? Over time, patterns emerge. You can detect which emotions are reliably triggered by exposure to certain platforms, which are artifacts of hunger or sleep deprivation, and which signal deeper values. When Mara started labeling, she discovered that many of her late-night scrolls were attempts to soothe boredom disguised as curiosity. Naming made the motive legible. Emotional alchemy then suggests a transformation step. Instead of immediately returning to the stimulus, convert the feeling into a small, concrete, non-digital response. If you feel loneliness triggered by a carefully curated feed, call a friend or step outside. If you feel panic provoked by a headline, write 1 paragraph exploring what you can control about the situation. If you feel envy, make a short plan to cultivate what you value rather than compare yourself to an image. The point is to interrupt the automatic reinforcement loop and redirect affect into agency. The fourth weapon is destiny recognition, what Steiner sometimes framed as the discovery of one's life thread. This is not fate in a fatalistic sense. It is the cultivated practice of noticing recurring themes, callings, and capacities across the stretch of a biography, and then testing small paths that align personal meaning with action. Under harmonic pressure, the sense of purpose is often flattened into marketable roles and external markers of success. Destiny recognition reintroduces interior teleology, the slow work of aligning choices with an emergent sense of vocation. A practical exercise for destiny recognition is a pattern journal.
Over a month, spend 10 minutes each evening listing 2 recurrent themes in the day: what you were drawn to, what absorbed you, what left you with a sense of completion. At the end of the month, map these entries and look for clusters, certain topics, people, or tasks that return with a frequency that transcends context. These clusters can indicate where your energies naturally gather. The map is not a commandment. It is a suggestion for experiment. Try dedicating a weekend to deepening one cluster. volunteer in a setting linked to that theme, take a short course, or propose a project that tests whether that thread might bear sustained cultivation. For Lena, an artist friend who had drifted into producing easily consumable short pieces for social feeds, the pattern journal revealed a recurring hunger for multivalent, tactile projects. Her experiment was to say no to short-form posting for 6 weeks, and instead make a single large work without photographing it for immediate feedback. The result was not guaranteed success in market terms. It did, however, reawaken a sense of depth she had thought lost, and that reawakening reorganized her practice in ways that eventually fed both meaning and income, albeit on different terms. The fifth weapon is art and solitude, practices that reclaim non-commodified space for experience. Art is not merely decoration, it is an alternative epistemology. It trains perception to attend to nuance, paradox, and irreducible value. Solitude is not isolation, it is the laboratory where interior experiments can proceed without immediate performance. Together, they create an environment where the aesthetic and contemplative faculties can repair themselves. Practical steps here are delightfully low-tech. Reserve 2 hours each week of no-screen solitude devoted to an artful practice. Drawing, making a meal with attention to texture, listening to a long record without scrolling, wandering barefoot in a park and attending to smell and temperature. Resist the urge to document. The point is to have experiences whose value does not depend on likes. This is hard precisely because our culture rewards visible output, but the small scarcity of unshared experience strengthens interiority. For Mara, the 2-hour rule was revolutionary. She started cooking with the slow intention of noticing aromas, time, and tactile sensation. The unspectacular practice of stirring a pot until it reached perfection became paradoxically an act of resistance, a reclaiming of time that refused monetization. These 5 weapons, attention reclamation, free thinking, emotional alchemy, destiny recognition, art and solitude, are not exhaustively new. They echo ancient practices across contemplative lineages. Their novelty here is contextual. They are positioned as tactical responses to a specific cultural dynamic that Steiner named a century ago. Each is testable. Each returns observable feedback.
Each, practiced together, forms a lattice of capacities that makes a person less predictable to an attention economy and more faithful to an interior metric that cannot be easily scored. There are, however, practical caveats. No single practice guarantees immunity. Progress is incremental and uneven. The presence of structural incentives, platform business models, workplace expectations, social norms, means that reclaiming attention is partly an individual matter and partly a social one. This is why personal practice should be paired with small social experiments, agreements with friends to limit certain kinds of sharing, workplace policies that reduce after-hours pings, local art collectives that prioritize process over publicity. Recalibrating culture requires both private discipline and public architecture. We should also return to the dialectic, Ahriman versus Lucifer. All 5 weapons are designed to avoid the 2 traps Steiner named, mechanical objectification on the one hand and airy dissociation on the other, by cultivating a balanced center, being embodied and awake, neither swallowed by the ledger nor dispersed into fantasy. How does one know whether one is approaching the middle path and not merely drifting from one extreme to another? The simplest test is functional. Does a practice make you more capable of ethical judgment, of bearing responsibility in relationships, of sustaining curiosity without losing groundedness? If so, it is likely moving you toward the middle. If a practice amplifies narcissistic spectacle or detaches you from shared obligations, it leans Luciferic. If it reduces everything to numbers by which you measure your worth, it leans Ahrimanic. That middle, which Steiner framed metaphorically as the Christ impulse, need not be accepted as doctrinal. Understand it as a descriptive term, the human capacity to integrate feeling, thought, and action in ways that preserve freedom and responsibility. Call it integration, moral imagination, or embodied wisdom. The name matters less than the function. What matters is whether you cultivate a center in which presence, judgment, and compassion coexist. There remains an existential knot at the heart of Steiner's warning, the modern tendency to treat consciousness as mere epiphenomenon. If the mind is reducible to computation, then the moral universe flattens. If the mind is infinitely airy, then responsibility evaporates. The middle path preserves dignity without mystification. It keeps the question open. What does it mean to live as an embodied being capable of meaning beyond metrics? This is the context in which we must consider the eternal witness, the experiential center that, when accessed, loosens the terror of annihilation that so often drives both extremes. In Steiner's practical language, the witness is not a metaphysical claim about post-mortem survival to be asserted as historical fact.
It is an invitation to a certain mode of experience, a capacity to observe experience itself with a kind of steady attention that outlasts immediate identifications. Many contemplative traditions have language for this: witness consciousness, the observer, awareness. Contemporary psychology calls it metacognition. Ecumenically framed, it is the sense that there is continuity across changing states, a minimal but potent experience that shifts how one relates to life and death. How might someone test for this witness without adopting metaphysical beliefs? One practical experiment. Notice whether, during a moment of strong emotion, you can become aware of the emotion as something occurring, rather than as your total identity. Observe, I am noticing anger, rather than I am anger. Track the sense of continuity that allows you to hold the event without being possessed by it. Does this distance reduce the panic associated with the prospect of loss or death? Does it allow you to make choices with more clarity? If so, the witness is functioning as an experiential tool, not as dogmatic proof. Mara practiced this by trying a short experiment during an intense family argument. Instead of identifying with the surge of injustice, she trained her attention to note the rise and fall of the sensation itself. The practice did not dissolve the conflict, but it did change her responses. She could choose to listen rather than retaliate immediately. The experiential payoff here is pragmatic: less reactivity, more clarity, greater agency. This is also where Steiner's call for verification returns with moral force. He repeatedly asked his listeners to test insights inwardly rather than accept them on authority. That posture dissolves demagoguery and invites personal responsibility. It also diminishes the appeal of simplistic explanations. The witness practice is not promised salvation. It is a skill that improves decision-making under pressure and reduces the small terrors that make people susceptible to simplistic, engineered narratives. At the social level, access to the witness supports communal stability. Political actors and market designers benefit when populations react predictably. The witness introduces unpredictable agency. That is why naming matters. When a thinker in a 1920s lecture hall used a word that exposed such tendencies, the shock was not merely to individuals, but to institutional imaginaries. Naming makes patterns visible, and patterns that are visible can be changed. We must at this point be candid about scale. Individual experiments scale unevenly. If 1 million people start practicing consistent attention reclamation, platforms and institutions will adapt. Business models will be pressured. Regulatory frameworks may shift. Conversely, the persistence of the attention economy does not cancel individual dignity. The small experiments matter because cultural shifts are cumulative. The person who resists the micro-death of attention in daily life disrupts the predictive mesh in her immediate circle. Family decisions change, friendships deepen, community practices shift. These ripple effects are neither utopian nor negligible. There is also creative resistance. Artists and educators have alternative levers. A school that revalues contemplative practice alongside testing. An employer that designs work around deep focus. A public broadcaster that funds long-form, context-rich stories. These institutions produce environments in which the middle path can flourish. Such institutional changes are not conspiratorial overthrowings. They are policy choices, funding decisions, and pedagogical commitments. They are democratic, pragmatic, and incremental. At the personal and communal levels, there are concrete strategies that combine the weapons into a coherent program. The following is a modest plan for a 21-day attention experiment, designed as a test of Steiner's claim that naming and practice produce change. It is not a cure-all. It is a disciplined inquiry. Day 1 to 3. Attention baseline. Keep a simple log of how often you are interrupted and how long you sustain attention on a single task. Measure in minutes and number of prompt-driven checks. Start the 5-minute attention sits. Day 4 to 7. Free thinking initiation. Each day, pick one belief, write pro and con lists, and engage in the contradiction exercise. Continue daily sits. Add 1 hour of art/solitude time this week. Day 8 to 14. Emotional alchemy and adjustment. Begin labeling emotions in real time. Practice small conversion steps. Call, walk, write.
and continue the attention sits with a slight increase in duration to 8 minutes. Begin the pattern journal for destiny recognition. Day 15 to 18, deepening practice. Reduce optional notifications by 50%.
Success is incremental, and the truest metric is the testimony of lived experience. We have, through this entire discussion, been careful to avoid turning metaphors into accusations. Naming Ahriman is an interpretive act. It clarifies a pattern without producing a literal investigative docket. That caution is not rhetorical nicety, it is epistemic responsibility. When the claim is couched as philosophical diagnosis, it invites personal verification and public debate rather than uncritical acceptance. Returning to our film metaphors one last time sharpens the imagination. Neo's choice to see the code, Truman's eventual escape from a staged life, Winston's tragic recognition of the power of language, all of these are dramatizations of possibilities and dangers. In reality, the stakes are quieter and more pervasive. The death of interior depth, the commodification of feeling, the shrinking of moral imagination. The films are useful because they make abstract dangers visceral, but they are not literal precisions. Use them as metaphors to guide inquiry, not as maps of secret cabals. We should also say something about grief and loss in this context. Reclaiming attention and cultivating witness does not make grief vanish. If anything, it makes grief more present and therefore more bearable. The witness invites you to sit with grief without being consumed by it. That capacity is ethically significant. It allows care, presence to others, and sustained engagement with the forms of suffering that are not immediately monetizable or performative. Now, imagine Mara again after her 21-day experiment. She is not transformed into a saint or a prophet. She is instead less inclined to reach reflexively for her phone at dawn. She writes 3 lines in a notebook each evening about what felt true that day. She schedules a weekend each month for art without documentation. She has not tilted the economy, but she has altered the architecture of her inner life. Her decisions feel less engineered and more authored. She has learned that a man who named a force in 1924 was not offering an easy explanation so much as an invitation. Name what shapes you. Test the claim through practice. Live according to what your attention reveals. There is also a civic dimension. As more individuals practice these weapons, collective norms shift. Schools can teach sustained reading and concentrated study. Workplaces can accept asynchronous communication norms. Platforms can be regulated to make certain manipulative features less profitable. None of this is inevitable. It requires political conversations that are not conspiratorial in tone, but rather practical in stance. What forms of design do we permit in public spaces? Which attention-extracting practices do we subsidize with infrastructure? These are democratic questions. Steiner's language of forces, when translated into policy language, invites civic engagement rather than paranoia.
We return finally to the opening allegation. This man saw the hidden forces controlling reality a century ago. That statement is meant to be provocative, and it is true if you read control as a pattern-shaping tendency rather than as a literal conspiracy. Rudolf Steiner, in naming Ahriman, offered a conceptual tool, a way to see the drift toward mechanization, objectification, and attention capture. In a century where technology has made prediction and measurement vastly more powerful, his warning acquires new resonance. It is not that he predicted particular corporations or devices. He maimed a structural tendency, the preference for quantification over mystery, for predictability over presence. Naming that tendency is exactly what makes resistance possible. You may find the name compelling, or you may find it irrelevant. The test is the same either way. Try the practices. See what happens to your attention, your choices, and your relationships. Steiner did not ask followers to worship a word. He asked for experiments. He asked that people notice whether the diagnosis corresponded to their lived experience. If you undertake this work, remember 2 ethical guardrails. First, avoid turning diagnosis into scapegoating. The point is not to vilify individuals who work in technology, science, or media. Many are sincere and compassionate, but to question architectures and incentives that make certain behaviors more profitable than others. Second, resist the seduction of purity. None of us will ever be wholly outside cultural forces. The challenge is to build capacity to recognize influence, to exercise moral choice, and to cultivate practices that sustain depth. At the close of our inquiry, there is an image that returns like a refrain. A man at a kitchen table, pen in hand, asking what felt true today. It is not a heroic image. It is an image of testing, small, domestic, stubborn. It is an image of someone who has heard a name spoken in a lecture hall a century ago and who decides to see whether the name maps onto the life in front of them. This is the invitation. Name what shapes you. Run disciplined experiments on your attention. Train simple practices that return you to the witness. Practice emotional alchemy so your affect is not simply harvested. Learn to think freely, to test beliefs, and to map your life for recurring threads of meaning. Make time for art and solitude that resist commodification. Where possible, push for public arrangements, education, workplace norms, platform governance that reduce exploitative design. The stakes are both practical and profound. An attention economy that colonizes the interior erodes capacities for judgment, compassion, and imaginative engagement. The alternative is not withdrawal into solipsism. It is a renewed engagement with the world from a place of freedom and responsibility. That renewed engagement is what Steiner meant, in his own idiom, by the middle path.
If you are willing to test these ideas, try the 21-day experiment. Keep a notebook. Notice what changes. Report back to someone, a friend, a community, the comment thread, about what you observed. Small testimonies aggregate into public knowledge. The suppressed lecture in 1924 could not fully bury a name once spoken. Names travel by experiment, by practice, by testimony. Today the name has been spoken again. Whether it alters you depends on whether you test it. If this exploration has moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate a modest set of experiments rather than grandiose claims. If you try the attention practice, leave a note about what changed. Even small changes matter. The hope is not triumphalism, but experiment and verification, to see in measurable and ordinary ways whether reclaiming attention produces the qualitative changes Steiner described. In the end, the man who once named a hidden tendency did not offer a blueprint for conspiracy so much as a call to practice. He asked that people look inward, test hypotheses, and live in a way that honors both mystery and embodied responsibility. That invitation stands. The forces that shape reality are not wholly hidden. They have names, patterns, and consequences. When you name them and test them, you begin to alter not only your attention, but the field of possible futures. Turn off the phone for 10 minutes after you finish this. Write in a notebook the first small thing you noticed, about mood, about impulse, about space. Call it the experiment of the evening. If after a week you find your days less staged, your responses less automatic, your interior life deeper, then you will have protested the architecture in the only way that matters, by changing the thing it measures. That is no small revolution. It is the steady, patient, unmonetized work of reclaiming what you are willing to live for. If you do this, leave a comment with what you noticed. Share this with someone who might be ready to test instead of to argue. The conversation is not about absolutes. It is about practice. The name has been spoken. The question now is whether you will try it on your life and see what it returns.